Okay.
Look like it started.
Yeah, it's starting.
Okay, thanks.
These classrooms are so pretty. These windows.
Yeah, I'm really confused when you were saying that. I thought you were like, this is what I'm gonna say next round.
Is it freshman?
No, I was
Is the judge from Lithuania here?
She stepped out
To the judges meeting.
Oh, that's great. She's getting it first up. Thank you. That's nice. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Is this you full of tools? I didn't see that.
Yeah.
People was asking.
You making fun of my handwriting over there?
I was like, okay.
Do you need me to interpret for you?
No, we just said fools instead of tools.
You gonna watch?
Yes.
Come on.
No, we do the timekeeper.
Oh, okay. Yeah, these two tables are free.
I'm just a bit confused by the judges.
The judges? Like,
Yeah.
That's so cute. Oh, that I see it. In the sky? Yeah. First I was like super confused about what this subject was because there's like colors and stuff. It's like an elementary school class. There's so many.
Does any one of you want to be the chairperson maybe?
To time the debate.
Ihr habt schon das Handy liegen, wollt ihr das machen?
Wir machen Timekeeper.
Ja genau, das heißt ihr müsst dann nur nach der ersten und nach der first seven vielleicht?
Nach der ersten Minute müssen Sie es auch klappen und dann
Ja.
nach der 7. Minute wieder.
Ja, ja.
Genau,
Dann-
also jeweils
also-
einmal.
Dann haben Sie
Ja, haben wir hier eine Liste.
Habt ihr?
Ja.
Okay, super.
Aber Chairperson müssen wir auch noch.
Ja, ja genau, also einfach nur quasi klopfen nach der ersten Minute, nach der 7. Minute noch
Aber
einmal.
Chairperson ist doch ein Textding.
Ja, ja, aber ihr müsst ja auch,
teilen.
ja, ihr müsst ja auch die Time
Ich mach
geben.
Time. Chair.
Du musst nicht vorlesen. Du musst das nicht alles vorlesen, du wissen das wahrscheinlich.
Okay, ihr könnt einfach
ja,
Sonst
sagen,
mache ich das auch.
Ja, der macht das.
danke.
Ja, und dann nach der 8. Minute du gleich zweimal
Und nach
und
38.
nach 15 Sekunden dann zweimal.
What are your speakers saying from?
The first speaker is
Und ich bräuchte vielleicht
Sarah.
zwei
Is
Sekunden.
Sarah?
Ja,
Is that or with S?
Die Tische, die sind
Like
auch
this?
so klein.
The second speaker is Colette, C-O-L-E-T-T-E. Yeah. And the third speaker is Aditya, A-D-I-T-Y-A.
Whoa, wait.
A-D-I-T-Y-A.
T-Y.
And the fourth speaker is Colette.
Yeah, you're the chair judge. So, Prop is Team Hamburg, right? And Op Team USA.
Ja, irgendwie.
Soll ich mir das schreiben? Okay.
ich schreibe mal meinen Namen und so rein. Also, das ist ganz
Welcome to this debate. Today's motion is this House believes that the environment is more important than economic growth, and on side position, we have Nele, first speaker, Alicia, second speaker, Lily, third speaker, and the reply speech will be done by Alicia. Please welcome them. On side opposition, we have Zara, first speaker, second speaker, Colette, third speaker, Aditya, right? And fourth speaker, Colette. Please welcome them. Our judges for today's debate are Anne-Sophie, Germany, and Deirdre Goutin.
Yeah, good.
Okay. Sorry. Please welcome them too. So you know the rules. First and 7 minutes are protected. The first and the last minute are protected from points of information. And yeah. Please welcome Nele, first speaker from Side Proposition.
What do we need to live? We need the air to breathe, the water to drink, and the soil to grow our plants and food on. Even though everybody knows that we can't live without these three things, we keep on destroying and polluting the air, the water, and the soil, and way more things. Welcome, dear ladies and gentlemen. Welcome for the first time from Team Proposition, and I'm going to start with a definition. We define the environment as a natural habitat of all living organisms, surroundings or conditions in which a person, animal, or plant lives or operates. Also included natural resources like water, minerals, air, organisms, and all other external factors. We define the economic growth as an increase of the general globe or regional economic performances measured in gross domestic products, shown from GDP. An increase of productivity and quality. So, we are going to prove to you today that the environment is more important than economic growth and why the preservation of the environment is more beneficial in the long-term effect. Firstly, through the status quo, I'm going to show you what is happening to the environment through the economic growth. Then secondly, what effects these damages will have on the future. And lastly, I will prove to you why the economy can't exist much longer through the lack of resources. Furthermore, my second speaker is going to extend my points and goes further more into our moral obligation. So let me start with my first point, status quo. Through the profit-oriented companies, our environment is slowly dying. Companies always want to improve, want to get more money, and want to lose the least money as possible. That is called capitalism. Through the growing economy, the companies need to grow to the steady competition between the companies to always be the best. The companies don't care about the environment. They are destroying it. No, thank you. They are destroying it to get more profit because caring for the environment would mean limitation. Our today's air, water, and soil pollution is caused by the companies. Companies put their trash simply in the ocean instead of recycling it because it is cheaper. Also, through the trade which came with the globalization, a lot of container ships bring goods from one country to another, and the companies are willing to ignore that these container ships cause already 2% of the world's emission. So why is this important? This is important because the water pollution is rising from year to year and won't stop due to the urge of the companies to always get more money. What the companies totally ignore is that already over 1 million seabirds and 100,000 sea mammals are dying each year through this pollution. Simply the Mississippi River carries 1.5 million metric tons nutrient pollution into the Gulf of Mexico, which causes a dead zone in the size of New Jersey. More than 1 billion people have lacked access to clean water, and 2.4 billion people don't have adequate sanitation. Also, there's a water illness that is caused by the growing economy and through the trash that all the companies, factories simply throw away. And this water illness killed 760,000 children each year. So, no, thank you. Further, there's the air pollution that is caused by the economic growth, which is caused by things like cars, planes, or factories. Again, nobody takes care of this, and the CO2 percentage raised in the last 100 years over 40%, more than 40%. In 2012, around 7 million people died, which is 1 in 8 of total global death as a result of air pollution exposure. So why is this important? This is important because what are we going to do when most of our air is polluted and the economic growth keeps on cutting the forests down, which could be the easiest way to get rid of part of this pollution. Yes, please.
What about the global south who isn't driven by a profit motive, but is simply trying to get by with the economic resources that they have?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So what about the global south who's not being driven by an economic motive, but is instead just using resources like fossil fuels in order to just get by?
So my second speaker is going to explain that. So let me come to my second point. What effects will this have on the future? Due to the global warming, which comes through the pollution, which comes through the economic growth, like I just told you, the temperature is rising by the end of by the 21st century between 2 and 6 degrees. What does that actually mean? What effects does it have on the Earth? And in the Arctic, all the ice is melting, and the animals that live there die because there is no more ice and no more, their living habitat is destroyed. And also the sea level is rising, and through that the islands are also getting floated. But not only the temperature will have effects on the future, also through the damage which is happening to the soil, which is then often not plantable anymore. Damage is done to the future. So there is no humus on the surface anymore. So no minerals, and that leads to desertification and erosion. And this is not good because people have simply less place to grow the plants on which they need to live and to survive. All the damage and pollution that is done to the water and the animals that live there can't be rebuilt, like the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. This is important because when we keep on living the way we do it right now, we won't be able to, we won't have a lot of future generations. Because of the soil, no thank you, the soil which is mostly not plantable anymore, the air which is polluted, and the water where the animals die, and this is only getting worse. So how are there going to be future generations? No thanks. Let me come to my third point, my last point. Economy can't exist much longer due to the lack of resources. Fossil fuels like oil, coal, natural gas are world's primary energy sources. Fossil fuels are formed from organic material and natural processes over millions of years, what actually means that one day nothing of this will be left. Our world's primary energy will be gone. Instead, we have a lot of pollution. Right now, we consume over 11 billion tons of oil. But not only fossil fuels will be gone, also things like wood and animals are already massively decreasing. And rainforests, which are cut down for oil plantations or get burned, take 350 years to regenerate without human interaction, while we would actually need the forest to use them against the air pollution. So why is this important? Because at some point there won't be any more fossil fuels, and also the way of getting the fossil fuel is very dangerous and can cause a lot of harm. So the world's primary energy source will be gone, and what then? We need the environment to survive, because without the air, soil and water we can't survive. So if others given reasons are likely to propose.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 6 seconds.
I would now like to call upon Sarah, first speaker of the opposition.
In a world where 1.3 billion people live in extreme poverty, and where 805 million suffer from malnutrition, and where poverty destroys the lives of citizens every single day. Economic growth is increasingly more important. And because a stronger economy leads to a stronger world, we oppose the motion. This House believes that environment is more important than economic growth. In this speech, I will be doing 3 things. First, going over framing points to consider. Second, arguing the first 3 arguments on the proposition. And finally, presenting the first 2 opposition arguments, which are first, country's moral obligation, and second, industrialization growth, while our second speaker will present our third argument on obtaining resources for protection. But first, a few things to consider to help you frame the debate. There are 2 levels of today's debate, the principle and the practical. Specifically, since the global south makes up to 2/3 of the world's population, they should be a key factor when considering today's debate. Additionally, the proposition must show the unique benefits to prioritizing environment over economic growth when the 2 come in conflict, while the opposition must show the obligation we have to protect the economy over the environment. But next, going off the first 3 arguments brought up by the proposition. Their first argument, they continue to state harms granted to the environment through economic growth. First of all, in the world of the opposition, we can still preserve the environment after securing economic growth first. Specifically, it is easier for a nation to switch to renewable energy to fix their environmental standpoint once they have the economic capabilities to do so. Second, we can't expect the global south overnight to be able to pay for the type of resources the proposition would require to fix each of the harms presented in their first point. But more specifically, if we go with the world of the opposition, we give developing nations the chance to gain the economic capital they need to properly transport their individual energies into something more sustainable. Next, they give the example of companies, discussing how individual companies give off wastes that harm the environment. Unfortunately, the globe is extremely dependent on these companies. Look to the example of China's iron and steel industry that provides thousands of people's jobs. The answer to this problem is not the world of the proposition, but that of the opposition, because we prove that we are saving individuals' lives by keeping them out of poverty, providing them with jobs, while these individual companies can gain the economic capital they need to actually produce the environmental sustainability they need in the long term. More specifically on their second argument about why this is important. First of all, they go through the list of harms that come off of these environmental impacts. But we prove to you through the world of the opposition that the harms coming off the proposition impact more people than any, one specifically being poverty. In 2002, the World Health Organization did a study proving the top 4 leading risk factors to health in developing countries, which were malnutrition, unsafe sex, unsafe water, lack of sanitation, and hygiene. All of these can be attributed to poverty. These were the 4 largest health reasons why people were dying in these specific nations. And all of these can be attributed to poverty, meaning that if you look to the world of the opposition, it will be easier to solve these negative benefits that are harming thousands of individuals each day. But first, a point.
When you say that it's so easy to solve those problems, why aren't they solved already? And what do you want to do in order to solve it?
It is not easy to solve these problems. That is exactly why these nations need to continue to value the economic growth over protecting the environment, specifically because it provides unique benefits like giving individuals jobs or producing infrastructure so we can establish the basic health resources that citizens need for survival. More specifically on their third argument, they go into detail about how economic growth will not exist much longer. They give the example of fossil fuels. However, we prove to you that countries are more able to shift to different types of energy that are more sustainable once they have the economic capital to do so. Individual nations such as Iceland and Switzerland have done this exact thing. Once they develop economically, they have transferred their resources to ones that are more sustainable, proving the opposition completely solves for this issue. But finally, presenting the first 2 arguments on the opposition. Our first substantive argument is that we have a greater moral obligation to prioritize economic growth over the environment. There are 2 layers under this argument, our moral obligation and the creation of poverty. But first, countries have a moral obligation to avert poverty. Specifically, a government's obligation is to its citizens. Look to any basic social contract theory that proves people create governments originally to ensure their own protection. More specifically, the obligation for the government exists, not only to protect the lives of their people, but to ensure a positive quality of life for each citizen living within their nation, indicating that when countries have extreme amounts of poverty, citizens aren't able to afford food, water, education, or the basic access to health resources that everyone needs for survival. Governments have a moral obligation to protect citizens. Poverty destroys citizens, indicating governments have the obligation to reduce poverty. Our second layer is that prioritizing the environment increases poverty. Nations like China, India, and South Africa that are largely powered by cheap coal have this as a large power and job source. Ripping this source away from nations like China puts their nation at an economic disadvantage, harming individuals and throwing them into poverty. Valuing the environment takes away this industry, giving countries less money as a whole. However, prioritizing economic development has already led to a decrease in poverty in nations like Korea, India, and Taiwan, indicating that it will be more beneficial as a whole if we look to the world of the opposition. But first, a point.
You say that the gap between industrial countries and developing countries will narrow, but what do you say about today's world where the gap is even wider every single day because of this economic growth?
The gap in today's world is wide, comparatively speaking. However, if we look to the opposition over the proposition, we have a greater chance at decreasing this income gap across the globe because we are giving individual countries the chance to achieve economic success. But our second substantive argument is that prioritizing the environment over economic growth stunts industrialization for nations globally. Two layers under this: infrastructural growth and general development. But first, countries need industrialization for economic growth. By prioritizing the economy, we can increase infrastructural development. This means that countries and governments can have more economic chances to build roads, to build bridges for trade, to make power plants for energy, and to build ports to ship goods. More specifically, by prioritizing the environment, we can increase foreign investment. This is key to having a successful nation that can make hospitals, governmental buildings, and houses that all impact citizens. But our second layer is that the general growth of the global south is held back with environmental regulations. Restrictions impact each country differently. For example, a third world country is more likely to see poverty and backlash from the environmental restrictions that the proposition places. More specifically, environmental policies hurt those that they try to protect. Once again, look to the example of China's iron and steel industry that employs thousands of people. Ripping this away like the world that the proposition ensures would take away the funding citizens have. They won't have as much access to food, water, or the basic health resources needed for survival. So in today's debate, if you value life and you value short and long-term impacts, you will agree with us and oppose the motion.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 8 seconds.
I would now like to call upon.
Just one moment. Could we maybe wait with going on to the next if we like give you a little sign?
Yeah.
Just like 30 more seconds or so. Thanks a lot.
And can you be a little bit more loud after the first minute because I actually I'm not here.
Yeah. Great, thanks.
I would now like to call upon Alicia, second speaker from South Proposition.
welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's debate. Firstly, I would like, as my first speaker has elaborated the environmental and the economical challenge, I will furthermore in my substantial speech talk about the moral obligation that we have for future generations and for to conserve and protect nature and to cut our ecological space. That is what I'm going to talk in my substantial speech. But first, let me please do some of the rebuttal. So, ladies and gentlemen, obviously the opposition has not understood a main point in the economy, and that is that through economical growth, there is no such a distribution as the opposition claims. It is not like they say, okay, this distribution works as in developing countries get the support they want, that they need to have, during the industrial countries do not rise at all. No, that's the point. Industrial countries are the main part who improves by economic growth. So we have no thank you. So we have these industrial countries who also do outsourcing and no thank you, and who exploit the developing countries by using their resources, which they ask in the POI. They ask, what about the countries that are in the south of Africa, the south of our globe? In my opinion, I think they mean countries like Africa and also South America. I don't think that they mean Australia, because that is also a very capitalistic country. So these countries, they say they just use their resources in order to sustain their own life. Well, let me tell you that industrial countries, as in USA, Germany, France, etc., England, they use these countries, use their resources, use their fossil fuels, and no thank you, and use it for their own benefit. They produce their own things in those countries and then get the benefit. These countries do not earn very much of it. The only thing that happens is that they get that there's a big exploitation, because the only thing that they sell is the raw oil. They don't sell products or whatever. So they do not benefit from their own resources because the industrial country is using it. Also, for example, like three quarters of our world's forest is in our industrial countries. But the 1/4 that are not in our industrial countries, that we do not use, we use this 1/4 of forest from the developing countries. We think, as to a proposition, that every country should use their own things that they have in their own country. Well, to come back, they also talk about renewable energies. Ladies and gentlemen, let me give you an example. The USA has, in 2000, they had 3,000 gigawatt of renewable energies. Now they have 550,000 of gigawatt, but still they need 727 million points. So the question is, how long does it take? How long does it take that we actually have this renewable energies established in the whole world? It will take ages. Until then, it is already too late. All the benefits that opposition has claimed you to have, like infrastructure in poor countries and whatever, what I've told you is not going to work, because these countries are just getting exploited, and they do not improve because of this money that they have, because of the profit. Because of that, it is too long, and all the benefits that they were talking about, well, nice, but till this is happening, we don't have an earth anymore that we can live on. No, thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, also, they told us about the huge backlash that we would have through environmental limitation. Ladies and gentlemen, we say yes, there is a backlash because of this, of course, limitation of the economy. But we say, well, we take the risk because we want our future generations to live on an earth that we can say, well, you can use that. You still have things to live upon. You don't have to wear a pollution mask to school. You can still live a livable life because what we did. So let me come to my substantial speech. We said that our burden of proof is to tell you, oh yeah, and I also wanted to say, well, the first speaker ended with, team opposition is for the short-term and the long-term effect. Well, obviously not, because if we continue the way that team opposition wants to continue, there is no long-term effect, because we don't have it. No, thank you. But we as team proposition, we stand for the long-term effect. We don't just think about the right now, the things right now. We think about the future generations. So we said our burden of proof is,
why the preservation of the environment is beneficial for the long-term effect. And that's what we're going to prove to you today as well. So to expand what my first speaker said about the economic growth, is that it collides with the protection of the environment. Of course, on one hand, it depends on it through stabilization of the ozone layer and assurance of fossil resources, which are very rare right now, which they use also from developing countries. But on the other hand, the economy destroys it. Countries like now Russia, Iran, and Iraq depend on these natural resources, as in like woods and whatever. And but their 10 to 50% of their GDP is from natural resources. So we have this huge loss of resources that we have, and but also countries depending on it. So how is this economy going to work furthermore if we don't have the resources that countries need? So now let me come to my substantial speech. No, thank you. On the moral level, we have an obligation for our future generations to conserve and protect our nature and to cut the ecological space. No, thank you. The future generations, for our future generations, yes, we know that the economy has to decrease at some point. And yes, we take the risk in order to have, for the future generations, an equal access to resources and other benefits. They have them a safe Earth with limited catastrophes. That is called the principle of intergenerational equality. Because climate change, the economic growth, and plus the effects result in an inhabited Earth with like the pollution, the rising of the sea level as well. So, as a reminder, the lives that we are living right now are just like a split second in human history, even in the world's history. And we are also not the only living creatures on the Earth. 1 second, please. So that is why we have to keep this going. Yes, please.
Within the lives that citizens currently have, if they don't have enough money to even buy food, water, or have access to health resources, how is this in any way beneficial?
The point is, if they have the money to buy food and water, etc., but there's like no water left because we use all of it for the resources, because one production of a t-shirt costs like 4,000 liters of water. The question is why? How do we get to these resources? So we have the point of this future generation, but also we have to conserve and protect the nature. We benefit from the continuous presence of other species and nature. We won't be here without the nature. But still, there's a red list and the loss of habitats of animals and plants, etc. We will lose this diversity of plants and species. The nature has given us everything: water, air, oxygen, a perfect functioning system with photosynthesis, etc., medicine and climate regulation. And we've learned that we need to sustain what created us. Because of these reasons, because economy is just here because of our environment, and we think that the environment should be able to rule, to regulate economic growth. And because of that, because we are taught from nature, to betray nature is to betray us, and to save nature is to save us. That is why you should vote for the proposition.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 12 seconds.
I would now like to call upon Colette for that opposition.
Team proposition paints you a world where if we all join together, we can combat global warming. Now this world may seem tempting, but the sad reality is that it is not grounded in reality. Because on team opposition, because we believe that complex questions like how do we tackle global warming do not come with simple answers that we are very proud to oppose. So a few things in this speech. First, I will address the framing of the round and what should be considered. Second, making just one point of clarification, then deconstructing my opponent's case. Lastly, and then defending the attacks they made on ours, and lastly, delivering our third substantive. So let's go to what we should consider in the round. We tell you two things. One, you should be looking at the global south, considering they make up a majority of the population of the Earth. But then second, that when we address how do we look at the environment and how do we look at the economy, when it comes to team proposition, they have to show you when these two things come into conflict, you always have to say the environment comes first. Now, going on to the clarification, we would like to point out on team opposition that we are not saying it's an either or, that you have to say the economy is always going to be more important than the environment. Simply, we can say that both can be weighed equally at the same time, that you can protect the environment and protect the economy at the same time. With that being said, let's get into the refutation. So going to their first argument, they tell you that there's this profit motive that is driving global warming and the exploitation of the environment. Well, when we look to countries like the United States, we would agree that yes, we do have problems when it comes to materialism and greediness that has led to the exploitation of the environment, but when we look at the global south, that this is not the same picture. Instead, the reason why these countries choose to use fossil fuels is not because some type of profit motive, because they're simply trying to get by. It's the only thing that they can afford. Therefore, when they talk about all of these egregious harms, like people do not have access to clean water or clean air and they're dying because of it, we think that these problems exist in the global south and we should allow their economies to grow so they can actually afford infrastructure that will allow them to have access to clean water and clean air. Simply telling them that no, they have to focus on the environment first will never happen if they have no money, no type of economy to begin with. But then, going to their second argument, they tell you that, well, with the increasing temperature and the increasing of global warming, that it's leading to all of this irreversible damage. First of all, we would tell you that, okay, yes, this is true, but that doesn't mean you still can't focus on the economy. We see that sustainable growth is still a thing. Like when you look to Sweden, in Switzerland, they have great economies, but they still look at the environment too, because they understand that you can have both at the same time. You don't have to prioritize one over the other. But then second, once again, we think when it comes to the global south, we have to let their economies grow first before they can even be able to afford things like green technology, something they simply cannot do right now where they are. But then, going on to their third argument, they tell you that, well, if we all depend on fossil fuels, they're going to eventually disappear. Well, this may be true when it comes to the global south that relies on this the most. They literally cannot afford anything else. We would tell you that the only way to bring them out of this, the only way to help them afford greener technology in the future is to continue to let them use them. But then second of all, we see that this is true. When you look at countries like China who have been able to adopt more cleaner, more efficient things, such as making their steel industry a lot better for the environment, this only happens when they're allowed to develop and using sources like steel and coal, something that can't happen when they're suddenly forced to switch to a completely different industry. But going to their last argument, they talk about this moral obligation to future generations. Well, we do not think that future generations will have access to clean water or clean air if they don't have economies to begin with that can provide those very things. So let's go back over our case really quickly. We tell you with the first argument that there's a moral obligation that countries have to prevent things like poverty. And they try to tell you, well, when it comes to how the world works, simply allowing countries to grow their economy doesn't actually mean anything because it's not being distributed evenly because smaller countries can't compete. We say this might be an issue of how things work, but they're never going to be able to compete unless you allow their economies to grow just as big. So we would say that when it comes once again to the global south, we have to let their growth continue, not let it stop. But then going to our second argument where we talk about how industrialization is only going to be harmed if we force countries to solely focus on the environment. They make a huge contradiction here. They say, well, we shouldn't even do this in the first place. It's going to take too long for them to industrialize and switch to green energy, so I guess therefore we shouldn't do it at all. So I'm a little confused about what team proposition is bringing in today. What we say, once again, we think we should allow them to develop. Well, we don't have a time for it, but we think that it's true when we look to countries such as the United States, such as most European countries. The reason why they can have green technology is because of their strong economies. So let's go so then we tell you about how these regulations that you force on countries are bad when it specifically comes to the global south. They say, well, the regulations are going to be worth it in the long run, and that simply like protests about backlash don't matter. We're not talking about protests. The harms we talk about when it comes to regulations is that people are literally losing the jobs they have. This only increases poverty, and we do not think this should happen. We believe that you can still have a strong economy and still address the environment, something they refuse to engage with. So let's go down to our third argument today, which is that when you promote economic growth first, countries can obtain resources needed for protecting the environment in the future. Now there are two layers to this. First, targeted economical growth, and second, financial capabilities for environmental protection. So, when we look at the first layer, which is targeted economic growth, what we understand on team opposition is that once economies grow and have a strong economy, countries can then focus on the environment. And this is seen with many developed countries, such as when we look at Iceland. They have a lot of clean geothermal power, and they have vast areas set aside to protect them and preserve them. Why? Because they're allowed to have their economy grow in the first place so that they could afford these types of things. When we look to Switzerland, we see that they have proposed to decrease their carbon dioxide emissions by 20% in the next century. Why? Because they have been allowed to let their economy grow once again. So, what we see here is that when countries have the financial capability to do something about the environment, that's the only time they can do it. And we see this with developing countries as well. Once they start to develop more rapidly, such as Vietnam and Thailand, that are very close to being determined as developed countries, that they have been able to adopt greener practices, such as a cap-and-trade system that incentivizes businesses to decrease their emission rates. These types of things don't happen if we force countries to simply forgo their economies and pursue the environment instead. Which brings us to our second layer, that countries can invest in renewable energy once they have this economic capability. In the United States, we understand that yes, we do have a strong economy, and this is the reason why we use 22% of global renewable energy. And the only way we were able to get there is because we were allowed to have this strong economy in the first place. Because when we look at the global south, where most of these countries, about 1.2 billion people in them, have no access to electricity and they rely on fossil fuels, we would say that we should not force them into the dark, that we should not ignore them and simply say they're not doing enough for the environment and therefore they have to switch now. We think that this is irresponsible and morally corrupt. Because what we tell you on team opposition, that we have to help them out, we have to let their economies grow, and only then can we actually help the environment. Thank you.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 8 seconds.
I would now like to call upon the lead performing speech.
Dear future generations, I think I speak for the rest of us if I say sorry. Sorry we left you with a mess of our planet. Sorry we were too caught up in our own doings to do something. With this quote from Prince EA, I would like to welcome you for the third time from Team Proposition. In my today's speech, I would like to first rebuttal the things that Team Opposition said and then sum up the team case of my Team Proposition. Yes, so starting with that, I will start with the first main point of side opposition, which was that we need developing countries to develop that much till they reach a point where they can actually concentrate on on the environment. But we believe that that does not work because they always talked about how about the global south and how they need to develop, but we have showed you that economy does not help those people. It actually exploits them. No, thank you. Because they don't even get the profit. They don't even get the money because companies from foreign countries come into their country and cut their wood and use their soils. So no, thank you. So we have gave you that example of 1/4 of wood only being in those countries. It used to be so much more, but dear ladies and gentlemen, all of that wood has been cut down in those countries, that which shows that that the industrial countries only use the wood of those poor countries, which shows again that economy only exploits those countries and does not help them. And secondly, that if we would wait for those economies to develop so much till they reach that point on actually being able to concentrate on the environment, ladies and gentlemen, if we would wait for them, that would be too late. Because we have the problem right now. We have climate change right now. We have the greenhouse effect right now, and it will not stop. And those problems will not wait for for those countries to get into a point where they can concentrate on them. Because if we would wait for them, it would be too late. We wouldn't have any clean water to drink. Team opposition always said that without economic growth, those countries will never have the possibility to have clean drinking water. But dear ladies and gentlemen, if we do not focus, if we not prioritize the environment, no one will ever have the chance for clean drinking water. Yeah. No, thank you. Yes. My second point. Team opposition said that the gap between developing and industrial countries will narrow. But dear ladies and gentlemen, I already said that would not happen because, as I already told you, the gap is only getting bigger and bigger because of industrial countries and exploiting those countries. Yes, then the third point, which is the moral obligation. Both teams have talked about the moral obligation. Team opposition showed us the moral obligation from the government towards its citizens, having to protect their citizens by economic growth. That is the only way they actually protect the citizens in order for them to not lose their jobs and stuff. And team proposition showed you that. No, thank you. It is. That will not matter because if, of course, economy is important. We agree on that. Of course, that is true, and that people need their jobs. But it does not matter because, for example, team opposition gave us an example of China, that most of the people work in the steel industry, and that we cannot just take that away. That is what team opposition said. But dear ladies and gentlemen, what if there's no steel left? What does steel industry, in a second, what does steel industry matter to any kind of, anyone if there's no steel left? Because that is what would happen. Yes, please.
That is why countries like China can follow the leads of those that are fully economically developed, like Iceland or Switzerland, and slowly switch to different types of energy.
Thank you, but as I already said, that would, first of all, that would just take too long. I mean, steel is just one example, but we don't have, because the lack of resources is, I started many years ago, and if we wait for China to be that green so they do not use so much steel, then the steel would already be gone. So we cannot afford to wait that long. Then I want to come back to a point of information that that team opposition gave to my second speaker, where she was talking about that this generation is only a split second of humankind, and the question was that in the lives that people are living now, what would we do with that? What would they do without the money they get? And again, ladies and gentlemen, what do people need money for? Because they need money for clothing and water and electricity. But what would that make a difference in the long term? Because if we have no water, for example, why do we need a clean water system for everyone if there's no clean water to drink? Yes, then team opposition was talking about the backlash that this proposing to this motion would bring. But ladies and gentlemen, again, we would take the risk in order to have a good environment. We have to take that risk, because if we would not take that risk, the environment would be completely destroyed. So to sum up my team case again, is first the environmental level. We only have a limit of resources, and if we do not prioritize environment now, the pollution would get even worse, and yes, we just cannot afford that. Second level, economic level. Economy is based on the environment. For example, if we come back to that China example, if we have if in the steel industry, which is based on the steel as the name says, it won't matter in the least. So the third level was the moral level, that we have an obligation to all the future generations for them to provide a world where they can have a good life in, and where they have clean water and fresh air. So again, we are apart from nature. To betray nature is to betray us, and to save nature is to save us. So for all these given reasons, I beg you to propose this motion. Thank you.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 34 seconds.
8 minutes and
34.
I would now like to call upon Aditya from said opposition.
Because poverty destroys the lives of millions, because a lack of industrialization creates a lack of environmental protections, we see that economic growth is crucial to the development and the well-being of nations. Because a better economy means a better world, we're proud to oppose today's motion. So today I'm going to ask two questions. First, why does this motion need to be opposed on principle? And second, why is economic growth better in the long term? So first, let's look at the principle level in today's debate. Colette and Sarah both told you that what we need to look at in today's debate is both the principle and the practical level. And team proposition, since they haven't engaged with our framing of the round, most certainly agree to this. So let's look at the principle in mind. Team opposition has shown throughout this debate that we have a moral obligation to prevent poverty. On the other hand, team proposition brings you this moral obligation to help future generations. We think it's a great idea to help future generations, but team proposition misses the fact that when we leave generations in the future to be stifled under increasing poverty, worse economies, and all in all worse lives, that's not helping future generations. Team Proposition continues to tell you exactly how future generations are benefited by increasing environmental regulations, but they never actually show that. Team Proposition would tell you that the environment is bad. They tell you the status quo is bad. And they tell you that if we continue the status quo in the future, it's going to run out. No, thank you. But what Team Proposition misses is that developing nations and developed nations don't continue on the process of pursuing economic growth blindly. Instead, what Colette and Sarah both told you is that when developing nations, when the nations in the global south, and when developed nations reach a point where they're able to make environment and economic growth balance equally, what we see is that those nations are able to industrialize and also protect their environment. Team Opposition tells you that what happens in an opposition world is that we allow countries to industrialize and then we allow them to increase their environmental protections. Team Proposition never tells you why any environmental regulations are going to help. They never show you that environmental regulations are going to address the problems that our current levels of environment have created. But first, you disagree.
Yes, but don't you think that if all the countries would be developed countries, the economy would be so big that even renewable energies wouldn't help anymore?
Okay, first of all, we don't suggest that renewable energies are the only solution. We brought up cap and trade systems, other forms of regulation, other forms of addressing carbon emissions, other forms of addressing pollution. But the problem, and what you miss, is that developing countries literally can't afford some of these regulations. Sub-Saharan Africa relies on cheap coal. India, China, all of those nations rely on cheap coal in order to industrialize. And the problem is at the point where you're telling those countries they can't rely on cheap coal anymore, instead of shifting their economies, or instead of shifting their countries to better environments, you're actually shifting them to worse environments. Here's why. When you limit environmental growth, when you limit economic growth for environmental regulation, not only are more people pushed into poverty, but people use cheaper options for electricity. That isn't green energy. It's not fossil fuels. Oftentimes it ends up being biomass. In sub-Saharan Africa, over half the population relies on wood. Relies not on wood or relies not on fossil fuels or green energy, but relies on wood, dung, that kind of biomass to heat their homes. And the problem is that creates more dangerous pollution than fossil fuels ever do. Team Proposition doesn't understand that their environmental regulations not only cripple the economies of the global south, but they force those economies to use worse fuels than Team Opposition's work. Team Proposition would have the global south stifled while industrialized nations continue to develop. They have the global south forced to use technology that they simply don't have the money to. They have the global south push into more poverty, worse regulations, and all in all, they increase the harms to the long term. Team Opposition shows that there's a principal obligation not only to prevent poverty, but because we agree that there's an obligation to help future generations, we're showing you exactly why economic growth does that. Sarah pointed out that the top 4 risks out of the World Health Organization's 10 risks were all linked to poverty. There's a reason the United Nations has their highest Millennium Development Goal as the eradication of poverty, because poverty is a crucial determinant in the future of generations. It's a crucial determinant in the well-being of nations. And insofar that Team Opposition is the one that's able to increase economic growth and that's able to decrease poverty, we see that there's a clear obligation to protect economic growth. But now let's go to the long term, because that's where this debate really focuses on. Team Proposition continues to tell you that environmental regulations are good for the long term. But remember that we showed you that first, environmental regulations will only push nations like those in the global south to worse kinds of fuel, to fuels like biomass that are covered by the regulations they propose, because of the fact that those developing countries aren't able to access cleaner fuels like green technology. On the other hand, we showed you when nations industrialize, they're more able to take your point in a second, they're more able to develop regulations, they're more able to develop schemes that reduce carbon emissions, and they're more able to increase green technologies. But you would disagree.
Yes. My question is, they say that developed countries depend so much on the resources that they have, and they don't accept the limitation of environment. How will it continue if there are no resources left because of no limitations?
So basically your point has been this point about sustainability that you're trying to make, that if there's no more coal left, how will those developing countries succeed? First of all, we've shown you throughout this debate, and Colette answered in her second speech, exactly why economic growth solves that. Because what we tell you is that when you increase economic growth, you increase the ability of these countries to transition to other forms of economy. You increase the ability of these countries to transition to green economies, ones that focus on renewable energy instead of fossil fuels. On the other hand, your world creates a world where nations in the global south are forced to rely on biomass heating to heat their homes rather than green technology. Team Opposition provides a sustainable future for the long run. We tell you that with economic growth, countries are not only able to invest in the infrastructure that benefits all of the environmental problems that Team Proposition continues to bring up, because with infrastructure you can solve problems like emissions. With infrastructure you can solve problems like health. We tell you that infrastructure is one of the biggest things that increases a nation's well-being in the long run. And we've never seen any engagement with Team Proposition on this, other than they tell us it's too little, it's too late. You see, Team Proposition's entire arguments, entire rebuttals to our case can be summed up when they say it's not going to do enough, so let's not do it. When they tell you that China shouldn't be using steel now because it's going to run out in the long term, they forget not only the tens of thousands who rely on the steel industry now and in the long term for jobs, but they forget the hundreds of thousands of people whose families are benefited by the steel industry. They forget the people who are benefited by increasing economic growth. Team Proposition continues to suggest that because something's going to run out in the long term, we just shouldn't be doing it now. We should force developing countries to instantly switch to other technologies. We completely disagree. We've shown you how not only does that stifle the economies of developing nations in the global south, but we continue to show you that it creates higher rates of poverty. We continue to show you that it leaves citizens behind, that it leaves the global south behind. You see, Team Proposition thinks that their side of the debate creates a world in which the developing world and the developed world has a limited gap. But we understand that that's not true. We understand that developed countries have the ability to equally balance environmental and economic growth, but developing countries don't. And insofar that they need to prioritize economic growth to protect the well-being of their people, we see that Team Opposition provides the best future in the long and the short term. Thank you.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 15 seconds.
It's now my pleasure to ask Colette to give opposition's reply speech.
Complex questions do not have simple answers. And it's because we believe on Team Opposition that there is no sense, no logic in trying to solve the problems of the world when you have no foundation to do so, that we are very proud to oppose. So a few things in the speech today. First, I will be going over the framing of the rounds, what should be considered, and then asking 2 questions. First, what is best for our country? And second, what is best for the environment? So going on what we should consider in the round. Like we have told you, when it comes to Team Proposition, we tell them that when you talk about the environment and the economy, when those 2 things are coming into conflict, they must present a very good reason of why you would always say the environment has to come first. We do not think they have provided an adequate reason today. But what we tell you on Team Opposition is when you look at 2 things, that we can tell you that you do not have to say the economy is more important, but simply that you can establish that both of them are important and you can view them both as equals. So, going on to the first question, which is what is best for the country? When we looked at developed countries, Team Proposition would like to force them to change their industries as a whole. We think that this will only destroy their economies, only allow more people to slip into poverty as their jobs are taken away. Instead, on Team Opposition, we say when it comes to developed countries, because they have the adequate funds to do so, that they should be allowed to still have their strong economies, but also have sustainable growth, which is exactly what we see going on right now. When you look at countries such as Canada, that have very strong economies, but still use a carbon tax, because they know that it's not going to hurt the economy, but will still help the environment. And this is seen in Sweden, in Switzerland, where they use geothermal energy, which is still good for the economy, but still very good for the environment. Team Proposition would like to get rid of their economies by forcing them to only focus on the environment. We think that when they do this, it only harms these countries, reversing any type of progress they've made on the environment. But when we look at the global south, what we see on Team Proposition, it's even worse what happens here. Not only are their industries destroyed, but they have no way to recover. Because at the point where a country literally has no money for electricity, how can we expect them to afford cleaner energy and completely transition to them? The answer is, we simply cannot. It's illogical. Instead, we should not be allowing poverty to increase in these countries and only endanger more lives, but instead we should allow these countries to let their economies grow using the resources that they have access to. You can't have access to clean water and clean air and food like Team Proposition wants us to do when you literally have no type of money, no economy to afford these types of things. Yes, we agree with them that saving lives is important. Saving the environment is important, but it's not just about the lives you're saving, it's also about the quality of life. When you have no clean air, no clean water, and no food, simply forcing you to harm your economy is only going to make those things worse. So going on to the second question, which is what is best for the environment? What we see here is that once again, no country is going to be able to help the environment if they have no money to do so. Telling them to switch simply doesn't do anything at all. Like Aditya eloquently explains, when it comes to developing countries, what we see is that they usually would switch to more harmful practices rather than green energy. But then second, what we see here is that once again, the only way countries have the ability to afford greener technology is when they have the money to do so. So, the big picture that we bring you here is that if we truly want to help the environment, we have to let countries help themselves first. Because there's no point in focusing on future generations and telling them that we can help them if we can't solve the issues that currently go on right now. Yes, resources in the status quo might be decreasing, but it's only going to be worse in the future when you have no type of economy, no money to go off of, and no way at all to help the environment at all. Because on Team Opposition, we stand for not increasing poverty and not preventing a way to truly mitigate climate change that we are very proud to oppose.
Speaking time was 4 minutes and 9 seconds.
It's now my pleasure to ask Alicia to give Proposition's reply speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we had a very interesting debate, where we had a few clashes about the obligation of the country and of the world, about which countries suffer the most and if they're the countries that can actually change something. We had a clash about renewable energies and about the long-term effect. So let me start with the obligation. So we said, so the proposition said that our obligation is to save the world for our future generations. The Team Opposition said clearly that the government's obligation is to support its people. Still, Team Opposition really focused on the south of the globe. Well, but we have always tried to tell you that the south of the globe is really not does really not have any profit of the economy of industrial countries or of developed countries. We told you that these countries are suffer under exploitation. They have the resources, and they told us that these countries depend on their resources. But the point is, what do they do if they don't have the resources anymore? They said, well, they switch just to green and just to green energy or something. But still, these countries depend